All right, welcome everybody. My name is Terry Eichel. I am with the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network. We are a faith-based environmental group, and we are committed to supporting people of faith of all different religious traditions throughout Connecticut to help them be faithful stewards of the earth. But I also want to say, even if you are not particularly religious or you're more spiritual or not spiritual at all, you're welcome here. We are glad to have you. We are very committed to helping people be good, faithful stewards of the planet. So this is part of our webinar series. Most of you, if you've attended any of our green forums, they were 90-minute in-person events. Remember that? We used to do things in person, and we would also often have food, and people would take food from the same plate. So, the green forums were great. They were all over the state, and they really allowed us to focus on different topics of interest with different communities. Obviously, with the pandemic, we've switched over to virtual and webinars. So that's been, it's always, we miss being with you, obviously, but it's nice to have everything online because then you can actually check it out later. So this is being recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube. IREGN has a YouTube channel, so you'll be able to review it later. And if there's anyone who missed it, you can also send them the link. So this is part of our webinar series. We've done a lot with gardening this year. We've done actually quite a bit with the elections and environmental justice, environmental racism, intersectional environmentalism. But we've also done a lot with gardens because this is something that you can really have an impact on the planet, on your native wildlife in a way that is socially distanced and safe. You know, it's something we can do right now. So this is putting your garden to bed, things to consider for a healthy landscape. Oh, why? Can I not? Hang on a second. Oh, there we go. So we have two more webinars in our garden series. One is Thursday, November 12th, featuring Jim Search, who is the education coordinator at Yale Peabody Museum. He is going to talk about how to propagate native wildflower from seed, which will be great, and it's a good activity for the winter. And then on Thursday, January 14th, we're very lucky to have a nationally known author, Doug Tallamy, who's going to do a presentation on native backyards called Nature's Best Hope. You may know him from his best-selling books, Nature's Best Hope and Bringing Nature Home, among others. There's more information on how to sign up at irejn.org. All of our webinars are free. Donations are gratefully accepted, but we are very happy to have everybody attend, and we never want cost to be a barrier. So today we're very fortunate to have Judy Preston from Connecticut Sea Grant. And Judy does public engagement and education for the Long Island Sound Study and National Estuary Program through the Yukon Connecticut Sea Grant office in Groton, Connecticut. Through a partnership with the Yukon Master Gardener Program, she runs an advanced Master Gardener Coastal Certificate program designed to teach sustainable gardening practices focused on reducing nitrogen inputs to the Sound. Judy has worked in the for-profit sector as a geologist and for over 25 years in the nonprofit conservation sector for the Nature Conservancy, and as founder and director of Tidewater Institute, a community-based conservation organization in the Connecticut River estuary. She taught environmental science and landscape ecology as an adjunct faculty member at Three Rivers Community College for 8 years. She currently hosts the Gardening for Good radio show at ICRV, the Connecticut River Valley Radio. She is passionate about the natural world, gardening, and gunk holing in the Connecticut River estuary. So we are glad to have her here. Thank you so much for being with us, Judy.
Thank you for the invite.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is just our website. If anyone wants to check out irejn.org after this, please feel free. We've got lots of information up there. So now I'm actually going to share my screen again and get Judy's presentation up. And I will hide my face so no one has to look at me. And Judy, you can feel free to just let me know when the next slide is up.
All right then. Well, welcome everybody. It's going to be cold tonight. It's not going to be quite this cold, but I'm actually hoping that we get some winter this year. I know some people won't like me for saying that, but it actually is. Having a good winter with snow is a lot better for our gardens than having a a cold winter without snow. It's a lot harder on plants to try to protect themselves from bitter cold when they don't have the insulation of snow. So I am going to talk today about something, as mentioned, that I'm very passionate about. Actually, the intersection between ecology and gardens, which is those two get along very well. So as the introduction mentioned, I do work for Connecticut Sea Grant and the Long Island Sound Study. And that means that I do a lot of education and outreach about Long Island Sound. And you might think that it's a stretch to talk about gardens as they relate to Long Island Sound, but actually everything we do on the landscape and every piece of Connecticut just about is in the watershed for Long Island Sound. So really just about everything that we can do here in Connecticut has the potential to impact positively or negatively on Long Island Sound. So I will be interjecting some of those connections in our talk today. But mostly I'm going to be talking about a lot of the experience that I have had. I don't know that that makes me an expert, but it does make me a wizened and certainly an experienced gardener. But I'm redefining in my own yard what it means to garden, what it means to have a landscape and to steward a landscape. And that has changed over the last, in particular, in the last 5 years or so. So let's get started. So plants are obviously central to this conversation. And the way we are thinking about gardens now has changed. In fact, Doug Ptolemy has mentioned more than once in his talks and in his books about how gardeners and people who love their landscapes at home really have an opportunity to go beyond just being a gardener now. We know so much more, and we're continuing to learn more about how landscapes are important on many scales. And plants provide habitat at many scales. So, you know, in this photograph, here's my hometown of Old Saybrook, and you can see how developed Old Saybrook is in areas. And of course, it's punctuated by beautiful marshes and open areas, but we have a lot of neighborhoods, and that's something that Doug Ptolemy has stressed as being sort of the last great hope. That's what he'll be talking about, his latest book, about how even our backyards, even a small backyard, even potentially a patio garden can make a difference, because making the links of everybody's yards in these neighborhoods can actually provide necessary nutrients and protections, habitats. And as is mentioned here, you know, our smallest bees can only fly about 3 blocks before they need to refuel. So that can make, you know, your backyard and your neighbor's backyard pretty important in the cosmic scheme of some of our smaller bees. But if you look at the cycle, you know, an individual moss or lichen can be habitat, or as you can see here, a bumblebee that's landed on a milkweed, or a abandoned lot, or a lot that hasn't been developed. The one that's on the top of this picture here is a lot in Saybrook that has since been sold and will be developed. But in just looking through this lot, there's so much diversity. If you leave nature alone, it doesn't even have to be a huge amount of time, but it has a wonderful way of healing itself and providing the types of resources that are necessary for things like insects and birds and small mammals. It's amazing how quickly that can recover if given the opportunity. And finally, in the picture to the right, you know, edges are very important. Natural edges from forest into field, or forest into lawn area, or forest into just an open meadow. These areas tend to be pretty dense. This is one that's near where I live, and it's just a beautiful example of trees that are then next to shrubs, that are then next to lower shrubs. There's some ferns in there, and then on the bottom, at the lowest level, there are plants. And that's a good illustration of how nature works the best, which is to provide multiple resources within a small, tight area. So let's look at that a little bit more. I I told you I'd be talking a little bit about Long Island Sound, and part of the connection between plants, no matter where you are in the state, and in fact in the watershed, the water that makes it to Long Island Sound goes through the watershed, which means it goes through maybe your backyard if you've got a pond or a stream. I grew up in Glastonbury, and we were fortunate to have a stream going right through the backyard, and that ultimately made its way down into the Salmon River and ultimately into the main stem of the Connecticut River and out into Long Island Sound. And even though distances, the entire watershed for Long Island Sound goes all the way up to Canada, and in fact, part of Quebec is in the watershed for the Connecticut River. And the Connecticut River is the largest single source of fresh water into Long Island Sound. But we have the Thames River, we have the Housatonic, we have a bunch of big rivers in Connecticut in particular that contribute to the estuary of Long Island Sound. And plants are a critical part of keeping that water clean or allowing contaminated water to be slowed down long enough to be taken into either soil or into plants. Maybe it's volatilized and introduced back into the air, or there are any number of ways that plants play a critical role in keeping our water clean.
Oops.
Ooh.
I'm sorry. Did I go back?
No, you need to back up.
Oh, here we go.
There we go. Okay, but you can go the next one.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I went by 7 slides.
So we know plants are important because they can buffer, they can be the front guard. That's why riparian buffers are so important next to waterways, because plants can go a long way towards cleaning water, or at least holding back contaminated water, particularly having to do with storms in the summertime. But the types of plants are also important, and I'm guessing that a number of you have drank the Kool-Aid of native plants and why they're important. And Doug Ptolemy is certainly going to be talking a lot about that. He'll be looking at it from the perspective of insects and why native plants are important for them. And the photograph on the left is a plant that was right off of my deck, and I happened to be sitting in my chair and looked over and saw this as a black swallowtail larva, and eventually it pupated, and it's all this time it was connected to a branch of my phlox plant that has a lot of issues on it. But that's part of having a natural garden, is that, as Doug Ptolemy will say, you ought to have a good capacity to not have everything be perfect. So native plants fuel long-standing food webs that plants that you bring in from other places don't. A good example of this is one of the plants that I planted, one shrub on either side of my front yard, a lilac plant. Everybody loves lilacs. They're pretty. They smell fantastic. Ooh, excuse me, I just swallowed a fly. Okay, I'm good. Speaking of bugs. So a lilac plant, it comes from China. They're imported, and they're imported in part because people love the plant and they don't want to see bugs. We have been taught for many, many years by the industry of plants and gardening that bugs are bad. I think what Doug Ptolemy has done, and along with some of his counterparts, has started to bring ecological concepts into our gardening ideas. The idea that, okay, some insects are harmful, but you know what? If you have an ecologically balanced garden, the good insects are going to help keep the bad insects down. And then sometimes the bad insects will have their way, like aphids. You can see aphids along a plant, and sometimes aphids will destroy a branch of a plant. But those are all things that we can, if we can look at it within the larger cycle of how nature works and what those insects are providing, it'll help us to not be quite so specific about what we demand our gardens to look like. So native plants are important for many reasons, but one of the most important from a water quality perspective, as well as habitat, is that native plants have co-evolved with the landscape. And in Connecticut, that means that the plants that have evolved over thousands of years with the temperatures that we have, with the precipitation that we have, with the type of soils that we have, and the geology that we have, they fit because they have figured out how to live in that landscape. And that means that once you plant a native plant, once it's established, it may take a year to get established because it's a new thing to put it into the ground and it has to become used to being transplanted into ground, but it doesn't need significant inputs of fertilizer or pesticides and even water. If it's the right plant in the right place, then it doesn't need inputs. And that's really important because part of what we're discovering over time is particularly with fertilizer, which are often nitrogen rich, that if a plant can't take up all of the fertilizer, maybe that's because it's had enough or because the temperature isn't right, then that fertilizer can escape either over the land or into the soil and into the water table and make it into Long Island Sound. And that's a real problem for Long Island Sound because too much nitrogen is what fuels hypoxia, which is ultimately low oxygen levels in Long Island Sound. And that's a problem for Long Island Sound, but it's also a problem for our coastal areas. And ultimately, when you harm and put too many nutrients or pesticides or toxins, those sorts of things into water resources, water is such a life-giving resource that you start to compromise the ability of watersheds to provide the resources that are necessary to fuel all of the life that rely on them. So if we can go with the next slide. Another good reason to think highly of plants is that the lack of plants or exposed soil without plants loses carbon to the atmosphere. It's a net loss of that resource into the atmosphere. And of course, we know that a changing climate is in part fueled by excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants, on the other hand, if they're rooted and you've got the green above the ground, it can take in carbon dioxide. It'll also exhale a certain amount of carbon dioxide, but it's very important to note that rooted plants will capture and sequester carbon, and that's important. You know, your backyard can be doing lots of things, including making a lovely place for you to live, but also remember that those plants are doing their part for helping to do its part to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere so that we can try to get our overall climate back on track. Next slide. So I'm going to go through some ideas and thoughts on what you can do in your garden that will make a difference. And one of the first ones, and one that's particularly important right now because all of these things are becoming available to us, are leaves. Now, if you think of historically, in fact, I was just talking to a friend today about, geez, I remember as a kid that we used to rake all the leaves to the side of the road and burn them. Of course, that's an air quality issue now, but it was an example of early on that we have been taught, and it's kind of been common knowledge that leaves are to be taken away from your yard, that they're messy, that if you let them sit the whole winter onto your lawn, it'll kill your lawn. So we have all these extravagant means, whether it's raking them and burning them when I was a kid, or now we've got those blasted leaf blowers that drive me crazy. But the whole idea is that we're taking this resource off of the landscape, and actually it's a really important resource. Not only because it's organic and it provides resources that over the winter break down and add nutrients into the soil, and trees will provide the resources from their leaves that are an important part of what they need at their roots. It's like this cycle. So they produce in the spring the leaves, and by the fall the leaves become a cycle of nutrients that over the winter break down. They also provide really good spaces for a lot of different organisms. And a lot of those organisms are the very organisms that will eat the leaves in the summertime and pupate and drop down into the leaf litter to overwinter and start the cycle over again. So this is a pamphlet, Leave the Leaves. I love this. Leaves are not litter. This is from the Xerces Society, and Xerces is an organization that's all about invertebrate conservation. It's a great organization. It actually had its early roots were here in Connecticut. One of Michael Pyle was a PhD from Yale in insects and has gone on to found this organization and to do a lot of great education on ecology. Leaves are one of the best resources that you can add to your garden. And in fact, I just have done that with my neighbors next door because I don't have a lot of trees. I had a big tree taken down this year just because it had gotten too big. So my next door neighbor has beautiful maple leaves. And I now have a thing going with my neighbor where we rake them up and bring them over and I distribute them in my gardens because they don't want them in their yard, but I absolutely covet the leaves. Now the pictures on the right are an example of just one of the organisms that I found nestled in the base of one of my gardens where the organic litter had been left over the seasons and broken down into soil. And on the top, it was just this tiny little jelly bean sized case with little tiny hairs. I do not know where those hairs came from in terms of if it's animal hair, fur, I don't know, but it was very light. And I picked it up and I brought it into my garden shed and just let it overwinter and see what would happen. And the picture on the bottom is the moth that emerged out of that simple gray case there. I haven't identified it yet, but it's a beautiful moth. And I do this whenever I can to try to, it's a lesson in observation. It's like the black swallowtail. If you look enough and you've allowed enough different niches in your garden for habitat, it's amazing. And Doug Ptolemy will certainly, he talks about this all the time. Of course, he has a very trained eye when it comes to looking for insects. But it is amazing what you can find and what emerges and what it tells you about a landscape that's diverse and that provides the resources that organisms need. I can't tell you where this moth fits into the ecological picture of my yard, but I can tell you that I absolutely loved discovering it. And I'm very happy that it's a part of my backyard ecosystem. So next slide. So here are some pictures of some of the ways and means of what you can do in your yard. Part of recent books that have come out, Claudia West and Thomas Rainier, there's a slew of books, and Doug Ptolemy's books that are really starting to look at the role of ecological perspective in our gardens. And there are some repeated terms and ideas that are coming from these books. And here are a few of them. I've read a bunch of these books in the last 5 or 7 years. And it's very exciting to look at how we think about our gardens. This is not my grandmother's garden. This is definitely my effort in my yard to try to still have a lawn, because a lawn is not evil. It's just, it's not as ecologically complex or as robust as providing the diversity of plants. And part of what, in particular, Planting in a Post-Wild World talks about is maximizing the diversity of plants and root types. So not only bringing in a lot of different plants, native plants preferably, but also I allow plants to self-seed and blow in, and sometimes I get seeds. My latest venture 2 years ago was to bring in evening primrose seeds, because I love evening primroses. I see them in fields and I see them on waste areas, so I know that they're a durable plant. And I brought some seeds in, and I just got this huge area of, they're biennial, so they'll have a rosette of leaves at the bottom for a year, and then they will send that very characteristic tall spire of yellow flowers. And at this time of the year, although they're starting to pass now, are finches that are coming through the yard and just coveting those seeds. So I love to hear the sound of finches chirping, and they hang on to these seed heads and go after the seeds. Those are the kinds of surprises in gardens that, if you allow the landscape to be flexible. I have ironweed that is a great native plant that I planted, probably 10, 15 years ago, and it has managed to work itself around the yard because it is distributed by birds, by insects, by wind. and it ends up in places that I didn't plant it there, but it's okay there. Or if it isn't, then I take it out. The idea is have some fun with your garden, and try not to have to be perfect. I've got some weedy species that are coming in. And in fact, I just planted some mullein, which is actually not a native plant, but it interests me because it's an interesting looking plant, and it does have a flower that seems to attract a lot of insects. So the picture on the left is in my front yard, and it was an experiment along a boundary garden that I was trying to put as many different plants as I could, and have them grow in together. And this is this idea of having different root types and having a constant cover of plants, because if you look in nature, nature will often opt for complete cover. It rarely is bare for long. There are exceptions to that, and there are good reasons for exceptions to that, which I will talk about. But the idea of having lots of different types of root, get some tap roots in there. I've got burdock in the scene on the right. You can just barely see it in the front. Now that's a weedy species, and it's come in, but it's got a deep tap root to it. I'm keeping it in there just to see how it behaves. And if it starts getting out of control, then I'll move it or I will pull it out. But the idea is you can have fibrous roots next to carrot type roots. All of that is good because the soil organisms that have become a part of that underground community, which is as complex, if not more so, than what's above the ground, is all part of providing the resources that healthy plants need. So the other idea is to keep the soil covered with residue. So you don't really want to have bare soil going into the winter. That can be mulch, it can be bark, and sometimes bark is just a quick and easy thing to do if you're putting in a new garden. But more and more, exploring low growing plants that you can use as part of that larger complex of different types of plants, and then let them compete and see how the plants move around. So next picture.
Hang on a second. Sorry, I don't know. Why am I frozen? Oh, is that what you wanted?
I hope so. I think so.
Okay, good. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So there's a big question about what do you do about fertilizer? Because fertilizer, as I mentioned, has great potential to be a problem, not just in Long Island Sound, but certainly we know there's a lot of research that's been done to look at the impacts of no and low oxygen levels in Long Island Sound, which makes for a non-livable environment under the water. But excess fertilizer can also get into the realm of excess nutrients, and you get algae blooms and nuisance blooms along the shoreline that can kill fish. It can fundamentally change the environment of nearshore and shallow marine areas that are very important as nurseries for fish and for shellfish in particular. Our eelgrass beds are extremely susceptible to those kinds of excess growth that are fueled by fertilizer. And you'd say, well, I put fertilizer on my lawn. It doesn't go to it's not going to Long Island Sound, but this photograph was taken right around the corner from me by a neighbor. And if you can see, I don't know how well the photograph is showing, but where that person is walking is the sidewalk, and the house is to the left there. And this person fertilizes a lot, and he uses a spreader. And of course, spreaders, depending on the type of spreader that you have, will spread out sort of a semicircular area around the spreader. So if you're going along the hell strip along the road, and you're using your spreader, the chances are pretty good that you're going to spread fertilizer, not only on the grass that you're trying to fertilize, but on the sidewalk. And that's a problem, because when fertilizer gets onto the sidewalk and there's nothing that's eating it or absorbing it, it sits there until the next rain, like tonight. And all of that fertilizer then becomes mobile. It starts to move. It it may break down, or it may just be taken, depending on how much rain there is, to the nearest receiving storm drain. And storm drains along our roads are out of sight, out of mind. Water goes down into them, and that's the last we think of them. But many, particularly along coastal areas, and in my town in Old Saybrook, most of those storm drains are taking water directly into receiving water. So in some cases, that's directly to Long Island Sound. In some cases, it's going to a brook or a stream that's going to take it ultimately to Long Island Sound. So none of that is remediated, and that's why fertilizer, particularly fertilizer that doesn't even have a chance to be absorbed by plants, like what goes on a sidewalk or in a driveway, is a big problem. So the only way to know how much fertilizer you need is to get a soil test. It's a pretty simple process. You can get it from University of Connecticut or from the ag experiment stations in the state. Not very expensive, but it does require you to have a thought beforehand to go out and collect your soil and put a little bit in the bag and send it. It's not a difficult thing to do, but it does require you to do it. This is actually a great time to do it because this is not when most people are thinking about it. Most people hear the first peeper in the spring or smell that first whiff of soil and boom, it's time to get out there and fertilize because spring is coming. And that makes it for a high competition for soil tests. So now would be a good time to go out and grab some soil and send it in. And the idea being that that soil test is going to help you understand what your soil does need, if it does need anything. And it's a valuable tool, particularly if you get it every year, because it can tell you if you need to add something to your soil to bring a nutrient up or reduce, it'll tell you if you're being successful over time. The other thing is we tend to think that everything loves nitrogen. We love to feed things because plants need it. But if you think about other sources of nitrogen, particularly in this day and age, atmospheric nitrogen, our automobiles, exhaust coming from our automobiles is contributing to atmospheric nitrogen. So when it rains like it's doing right now, that nitrogen that was in the atmosphere is coming down to the land, and that's contributing nitrogen to our landscape. Same thing if you're leaving your lawn clippings, you're not bagging them, that's excellent, that's a great thing to do. But that also, you're cutting the top of your lawn off, which has nitrogen in it because you fed it to be a nice green lawn. So when you lop off the tops and let them stay on site, that's good because it's organic material, but it's also loaded with nitrogen. So you don't need to be putting, or you need to account for the fact that you're adding that excess nitrogen. And finally, if you have problems with grubs, you can use corn gluten, which is an organic means of getting rid of grubs. I've never done it personally, but I've heard people swear by it. But it is a corn-based ingredient, and it does have nitrogen in it. So those three things alone are already contributing nitrogen to your lawn. So maybe you don't need to apply nitrogen. A soil test would help tell you that, or maybe you don't need to use as much. And in fact, there is a great study that was done a number of years ago. It's available on the internet from the University of Connecticut, but it was actually a study that was done by all of the land-grant colleges in New England. And it was looking at recommendations for water quality having to do with fertilizer. So it talked about all kinds of great management practices that you can do to help reduce the need for fertilizer and also to prevent excess pollution from getting into our waterways. And one of the recommendations that they came up with was apply 1/2 to 1/3 less fertilizer. It's a tough sell because particularly if you are in the habit of using the 4-in-1 products that give you a certain amount of food and pesticides or herbicides for every quarter of your lawn care regime, it's tough to not want to use it all. So their recommendation was a maximum of 2 pounds for 1,000 square feet of lawn if your lawn is 10 years or older. That the reason being that an older lawn has had time to accumulate organic material and get enough nutrients in the soil and build the soil up that it doesn't need as much. Whereas if you have a new yard, you can go up to 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And ultimately, the amount of times that you feed your lawn is extremely important. So you can apply the fertilizer. Now in this case, the recommendation is no more than twice a year. And I can tell you that some of the folks who have been doing this research at UConn say they would sleep better at night if people would only fertilize once a year in October. And the idea of no later than October 15th is when it gets cold, like it's getting tonight, our grass is no longer absorbing nutrients. It's putting itself to sleep for the winter. It's getting the message and it's shutting down. So if you're putting fertilizer down after October, more or less, it depends on what the season, how the season is going, but I've seen people putting fertilizer down as late as November and starting early in the spring before the plants have even woken up, with the idea that perhaps it will wake the plants up. But again, if you're adding fertilizer before the plants can take it, that means the fertilizer can either just go right down into the soil and into the underground aquifer, which ultimately makes it out into the nearest water body, or it can go across the soil if you get a really strong rain event and all the water that leaves your property is going to be laden with that fertilizer. So next slide. Is it not cooperating?
It's not. I don't know why. Come on now. There we go.
Okay. All right. So this is, I love this slide. This was part of a campaign that Puget Sound on the West Coast put together. It's an estuary, just like Long Island Sound is an estuary. And this was part of an ad campaign they did. Mostly I love it because the guy is such a character with the black socks and the shiny shoes. And the whole idea of the campaign was, you know, if you're fertilizing your lawn, remember, you're not just fertilizing your lawn. That was part of their campaign. Here in Long Island Sound, we'd like to say if it goes in the ground, it goes in the sound. And that's an easier way to remember that, you know, be aware of how you're using, you know, pesticides and fertilizers and things that it seems innocent enough. You put it in your lawn or in your landscape and then you forget about it. And if it's too much, then it has to go somewhere. Next slide. That was quick. So I do have to talk a bit about turf grasses because we have a lot of turf in this country, estimated 50 million acres across the United States. That number continues to grow. And in fact, almost 400,000 acres of land is converted into lawns in North America every year. If you think about it, that's an area about the size of the New England states. Most of that, after a study was done in the Chesapeake area, showed that most of that was in residential lawns. So we know that a large percentage of the excess nutrients that are getting into Long Island Sound, there's a large contribution that's coming from lawns. There's been a study that was conducted in the last several years by Jamie Vaudry, who's a researcher at the University of Connecticut Marine Sciences Building where Sea Grant is. And she and her colleagues looked at all the coves and embayments in the Long Island Sound area, New York and Connecticut, 110 embayments. And she used scientific models to project and look at the concentrations of different nutrients and pollutants that were getting into our coves and embayments. And these are the areas that are, you know, in our backyards. Whereas Long Island Sound is that big water body out there, and if you have a boat, you can get out and see it. But if you're like most people, you probably get to see the edges of Long Island Sound. So this is where we start looking at, you know, places like where I live. I'm right near South Cove, which is a lovely cove. And what I do in my yard, I know it matters because I'm not very far, and neither is the gentleman around the corner from me, who I lovingly refer to as Mr. Hypoxia. Is, you know, every time he's out there fertilizing his lawn, I know that doesn't take a big leap of faith to say that that's getting into South Cove, which then opens up into the Connecticut River and Long Island Sound. And that can be said too of pesticides. And pesticides, we have so little information about all of the different pesticides as they evolve. It's really been since World War II where we've really accelerated the use of pesticides and herbicides to control plants and in particular insects and pathogens in our yards in particular, which is why the lawn is such a tricky thing. In and of itself, a lawn isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if it's chemically treated and it takes a lot of water and it takes a lot of fertilizer, then yes, it can be a very harmful thing. I took this picture because this is another neighbor on another side of me. The sign here that says you don't have to choose between a healthy lawn and a healthy family. And yet right next to it is the pesticide applicator sign. So I think I'd argue that I would want to know what's in that pesticide to know whether that was good for my family and my lawn. Next picture.
Oh, I am so sorry. I don't know why it's not.
It could be because it's a pretty big program.
Maybe. Come on. There we go.
There we go. Okay. So something that also I know is near and dear to many of you who are interested in pollinator pathways and attracting pollinators to your gardens, which is such an amazing, it's a wonderful way to look at your gardens. And I love that at this point in time that the idea of thinking about gardens as pathways for insects is, that's huge. 10 years ago, we weren't talking that way. We were not thinking about insects in our gardens positively. So that's all the more reason to say to a bee, a lawn is a desert, because it really isn't providing any useful resources. And it's not just to a bee. I mean, if you look at your lawn, there are very few resources in a lawn. Even dandelions, a study has been done that shows that dandelions, Heather Holmes, who was a bee specialist, talked about analysis that was done on dandelions that said it really doesn't provide the amount of resources, the concentration of resources that's necessary for bees to make it through their life cycle. And that's important because they have life cycles in short, abbreviated seasons that they need to get the resources that they absolutely need so that they can pass on their genes to the next generation. And Doug Ptolemy talks about this. The question being, the non-native plants that we bring into our landscapes, they may be providing flowers, but is it like junk food? Is it, not really good resources for the organisms that we're feeding it to? So no seeds, no nectar, no fruit. Lawns are pretty much a desert landscape. Next. Right on it.
Yay.
So another recommendation is learn as much as you can about soil and about your soil, because they're fascinating. Soil is just an extraordinary resource. This image here is from a book called Mycorrhizal Planet, which is looking at fungi, and there have been so many great studies and reports and books that have come out on our increasing understanding of what's going on below the soil that is an interchange between plants and fungi and organisms below the soil. There's a great book out if you want to read more about this. It's called Teeming with Microbes, and it's Jeff Lowenfeld's and a couple of other authors. It's a really great, entertaining, and also extremely informative that talks about fungi. It talks about protozoa and nematodes and all of these organisms and how they capture resources, exchange resources with the roots of plants, because plants are still the only organisms that can capture the energy from sun. And so they have a very important, carbohydrates that they can send down into the soil. But the organisms in the soil can also bring resources like some of the minerals and other ingredients that are important to plants. So there's this incredible relationship between these things under the ground that's happening in a very complex way. And that is the reason why I also say minimize disturbance. We know so much more. When I first bought my home and started to to break ground for a garden. I really broke ground. I used my grandfather's little rototiller, and just, rototillers, they just pull the heck out of the soil and everything in it. And I realize now in retrospect, knowing more about the soil, that all of those delicate relationships, particularly of fungi under the soil, which are real workhorses in terms of exchanges of resources, I was just basically ripping everything apart. And even these pill bugs, this picture on the left, all of these organisms play a role in the processing and recycling of nutrients that from year to year are what constitute soil fertility. And a happy soil is going to make for happy plants. So the more you can learn about how to work gently with your soil and add nutrients. That's why adding leaves is so great, because you're adding more organic material, and the organisms from below the soil are coming up to the surface. One of my favorite times in my garden is to go out, and usually it's about March, and you could go out and there's a point in time when you all of a sudden can start to hear the leaves ticking, the leaves on the ground. There are no leaves on the trees yet, but you can start to hear the temperature has come up just enough, and all of the organisms in the leaf litter are starting to become active. That can be pill bugs, it can be spiders, it can be millipedes. There are any number of things. You can go out with a flashlight and just pull a little bit of that leaf litter aside, and you'll see all this activity as things are starting to come to life. So when you're cutting it open, and in fact, even in agriculture now, the no-till technique of agriculture is a hats off to saying, yeah, we get it now. When you break open the soil, you destroy the structure, but you also destroy the many organisms that are there that could help with your plants. So next picture. And more now for why keeping the soil in place and not disturbing it to the extent that you can is because so many of the bees that are an important part of pollination and also just resources, and it's not just bees, but in this case, I'm going to tell you about some bees because it's such an interesting lifestyle. So 25% of our native bees nest in cavities. So that can be in stems, it can be in rocks, crevices and rocks, anything that provides a little bit of protection over the winter months. But the rest of those are in the soil, and that requires access to the soil, which means that if you have a lawn like I have a lawn, and a lawn like what is in this picture, which means there are clumps of grass, and then there are some other things like in this picture you can see it looks like cinquefoil, and there are some basically shrubby lawn area. There's also access to soil, to loamy soil, to sandy soil, and that's really important because part of the lifestyle of a lot of our solitary bees is to have access to soil enough so that they can burrow down into it. This picture is of a landscape outside of a middle school in my town. I was returning from the Memorial Day parade, and I looked over and saw these little mounds in this lawn. Now this lawn is kind of like my lawn. It's obviously not a one that the school feels needs to look like a golf course. They mow it, and that's about what they do, and that's fine. What is amazing to me is that right outside this classroom, and I'm guessing without knowing it, there's this great accumulation of these little holes here. You can see on the right, that's what the hole looks like. That is a mound. It looks about the size of a good anthill, but the hole is about the size of your pinky finger or a pencil. And that is where a ground nesting bee has emerged. The nest was built in the fall, and the female, the center illustration shows that the female will excavate a tunnel, and then she'll make these chambers on either side. Then she'll go and collect what's called bee pollen. So she's getting nectar and pollen and rolling it into a little ball, bee bread, and putting it down into the chamber, and then she'll lay an egg in that chamber. And she does that for each, you can see those chambers there, so there's 5 chambers there. And her job is done at that point. That's the end of her cycle. But over the winter, or sometimes it skips and goes, 2 years, those larvae will mature. And as they mature, what's even more interesting about this is that, as you can see from this illustration, the larva at the top, closest to the surface, is maturing faster than the one at the bottom. And that's by design. The female has done that. I don't know how she's done that, but she has done that so that the first bee that emerges is a male. This is not for all of them. This is for a particular species, and maybe more than one species. But the male will emerge and stay at the top of the mound there, waiting for the other larva to mature and emerge, and they are females. And he will then cross with the females, and then they're ready to go off and start a whole other cycle. So this is where putting mulch, either stone mulch or a heavy bark mulch, even light mulch is okay. But when you start piling a lot of anything on, you're starting to take away the opportunity that some of these insects need for their own life, to be able to have access to soil, and particularly in a more south-facing slopes where there's enough pliability to the sand so that they can actually dig. It's a very exciting. The first time I saw one of these, it was so exciting, because then you start to get to see what it looks like, and you can start looking for more. And I have them now on a regular basis, not huge ones, huge colonies, but I have 4 or 5. This year was a good year. I had like 10 in my garden out front, but I've had them in the front and in the back. Anyway, next slide. Here's another reason why excessive cleaning in your garden and or making sure that soil is always covered could be a disadvantage to certain organisms. This is an example of, in the summertime, a bird, looks like a sparrow, hit a wall in my yard and died, and it fell down onto the soil. I decided I would just leave it there for a little bit, just to see what would happen, see if something ate it, see if it got insects, just out of curiosity, to see what happens when meat, which this has, is exposed on the soil. And I expected to see, beetles or something coming out of it. What I found, and I went out during the day, not a whole lot of difference, and I went out at night and looked. And what I found was, I put the image from the internet of the beetle that I discovered. I have a photograph of it, but it's not as good as the illustration. This is a sexton beetle. It's a beetle that eats meat, and we have a number of different species here in Connecticut. There are some of them globally that are quite rare, and it is the coolest organism in terms of, it comes out of the soil. I don't know how it knows that there is a dead animal there, but it knows, or maybe it's, it travels at night over the soil looking for these things. But within a couple of days, this bird had not been broken down, but had been buried. So these are, the other name for these are burying beetles. And they go underneath the animal and excavate. And so the bird, I have a series of photographs of it, but the bird just disappeared. So, and it didn't take long. It was a couple of evenings, and then it was completely under the ground. I was able to, excavate a little bit, and yes, it was there. And that's where the beetles probably were, they may have been eating, but they also may have been using it as a place to lay their own eggs. These are the kinds of really interesting things that, everybody's yard has the potential to show how nature works, but you have to allow some of the habitat, and that's part of what I'm hoping to give you. Next picture. So you've probably heard that that bees need places to overwinter, and bees need places to have their families, so to have their nests. The one that I showed you earlier is the underground nest, but they also, we have lots and lots of native bees. They also can use the stems of a lot of the flowers that at this time of year, the flowers have pretty much gone to seed, and the temptation is great to clean the garden, clean it all out, make the garden look nice, maybe put some mulch down so that it's been put to bed for the winter. And I'd like to encourage you, if not the whole bed, leave some portion of the bed, first of all, to go to seed, because birds in particular, but there are a lot of organisms that will use the seeds. And for the ironweed, which is the taller purple to the left, that's a wind dispersed seed. In fact, many of these are wind dispersed seeds. So if you let it go, it will allow, the wind will grab some of those seeds and propagate them elsewhere. But the other part is because a lot of these plants, the ironweed, the jopai weed, which is in the back, and even the sneezeweed, which is the yellow, the stems are hollow or have pith in them. And if you leave them over the winter, there are a certain amount of insects that are going to burrow into those stems and overwinter, because it's a great place to overwinter. It's firm, it's protected, and it provides a safe place for those bees to overwinter. So maybe if you don't feel like you can do that for your whole garden, leave some portion of your garden to overwinter. You can even cut it back a little bit if you want to, if it's too tall and you really don't want it to be that tall. But the idea is that, think of it, if this were in a field and nobody were taking care of it or managing it, then these would provide the types of resources that those insects need. Next slide. So here's an example also. There's the insects that are going to overwinter, and then there are the insects that are going to use the stems, some of them hollow, some of them still with pith in them, in the spring to lay their eggs. So similar to what I showed you with the underground chambers, there are, like the carpenter bee is a small bee that will use, to the left here, you can see the hollow chamber of this stem. That happens to be jopai weed that by spring, it's pretty hollowed out and pretty devoid of leaves. And that's perfect for a carpenter bee to go in and burrow down in and create, similar to the ground nesting bee, it'll create chambers and lay its eggs in those chambers. So if you can stand to let some of those stay and stand, on the right-hand side are my phlox, and that's the overwintered branches, and the phlox are coming up through the last year's stalks. And if you think about it in nature, the stalks would provide some support for plants growing up. And then I just cut the tops off so that I have a compromise between not having the top there of woody. I'll take off maybe 10 inches or so. And Heather Holmes, who is again the bee specialist, says 12 to 18 inches is enough to provide resources that are up enough off the ground so that predators won't get the eggs, and provide adequate. And then as the plant grows, it's going to cover those stalks anyway. So the other thing that Heather Holmes talked about, she came to the Connecticut Botanical Society meeting a couple of years ago, and it was terrific. And she said, depending on the plant, certainly this is true for jopai, those 12 to 18 inches also can be a deterrent for deer, because they can be sharp and firm, and the deer don't like to try to get their head down into it. So just saying. So your garden, if you leave your leaves and your branches up, this is my front yard garden. The street is out towards the top of the picture. And there are definitely people who would say this is messy. I don't like it. It's messy. That should have been cleaned up. But I think some of this is education. Some of this is I have great neighbors, and they don't always understand what I'm doing, but I always invite them to see when I find something interesting. Or monarchs in particular are a great segue to talking to people about why leaving some vegetation over the winter is a great idea. But this provides, as I think you can see here, when we had snow, that snow with branches creates a lot of pockets of air, and those are insulating pockets of air. The other thing is, right in front of my kitchen window one year, I had branches of my Kothui bush, which is right out in the front here, and there was a praying mantis egg case. And this was a particularly tough winter. This was very cold. There was a lot of snow, and the birds were really looking for stuff. And I noticed several chickadees and titmice who had found that praying mantis egg case and were wailing away at it because that's the kind of energy that they needed during a cold winter season. It wasn't good for the next generation of praying mantis, but it was great to have access to that for these birds during a tough winter. Next slide. Some of the easier things that you can do, again, it can be a tough sell for some people, but the log on the right is a piece of wood that I found. You know, there's been so much preemptive cutting of trees in Connecticut that finding wood along the road is not a problem. And this one was particularly good because it already had holes in it. It obviously had been a tree that was dying or being damaged as it was standing. And when it was cut, this was just lying on the ground. And I put this, just rested it in a portion of my garden. The nice thing about this is it adds visual interest. It also adds habitat for various species, whether that's insects or small rodents or any number of things that use it. And as it breaks down over time, it's adding nutrients. It's also providing a resource. You know, mice will very often move through the landscape along the edge of downed wood because it's a little bit more protected to go along the edge of the log than it is to be out in the open or on top of the log in terms of owls or other predators. In fact, I worked for a while with the Nature Conservancy, and there was a rattlesnake researcher, and he was tagging rattlesnakes, and he said one of the way to predict where he could find rattlesnakes was wherever there was a downed log, the rattlesnake would be at the end of the log because the mice would be running along the edge of the, you know, in the along the crease of the wood or along the edge of it and pop out the end, and there the rattlesnake would be. So there are many good and bad ways, but it's all part of the food web. And, you know, even something like a slug, which most people would probably not say is their favorite organism, but, you know, if you are a bird or if you're an organism that needs a nice chunk of food, that's a great thing to have in your garden. And that wood will break down. Next. Another thing, if you have stone walls on your property or even can bring in, these are cobbles that I have brought in. I love rocks, so I tend to collect rocks no matter where I am. And even just creating a small area of rocks, it's amazing how many insects use the crevices or the areas as protection and also to get out of heat, to get out of cold. It's an important place. And it's a very simple and I think a beautiful way to apportion your garden and provide habitat at the same time at no great expense. Next. Water is so important. I can't stress enough how important water is in the landscape all through. I mean, it can conceivably, with the winters that we've been having, you can conceivably have water available all through the winter and it's valuable, but particularly during like this summer, I have never seen as much activity as I have. I have 3 or 4, actually I have 4 or 5 now, water features around my yard. This is a small one. It's only about 2 inches deep when it's full. And I find that some of the smaller birds, the finches and the wren use this as both drinking, but also as the perfect size for bathing. And then I have a deeper one that some of the larger birds use. If you have a large water feature, it's nice to put like a stone in the center of it so that a bird can land on the stone and dip, as opposed to, I found it's actually kind of interesting to watch mockingbirds, catbirds. They get a little nervous if the water's too deep, so they have to kind of test the water before they'll take a full bath. The other thing that's great about water features is that it's not just birds. We tend to call them bird baths because birds will definitely come, particularly when you have a drought like what we have this year. But I also found that towards the end of the season, I had a lot of yellow jackets that were coming to this feature, and they would come in predictably in the evening. And it was so great because you could see the yellow jacket just go down this gentle slope. And then you could see this little tiny ring of water where it was, had made it to the water and was drinking. It was a lovely thing to see, very, very meditative. So to the extent that you can provide water and try to keep it as clean as you can, I have to, during the hottest days of the summer, I have to scrub these. I just have a stiff bristle brush that I'll brush it out and then put clean water in. But it's really a wonderful thing to have, both to watch wildlife and also to feel that you're really providing an essential resource. Next. So I had started to load this up with more photographs, but at some point my computer just doesn't like how many photographs I have. So I was going to show all these different pictures. The landscape of Connecticut provides so many opportunities to get inspired by what you could do in your yard. This is a pathway that goes through a preserve in Old Lyme, just a footpath. And this is our native Carex pennsylvanica. There are so many plants now that are becoming more available to use and in your home landscape. And there's so many opportunities to go out and look at different landscapes from the perspective of, if you have a woodland backyard, go to a wooded area and see how some of these wooded areas that you love, what makes that landscape something that really speaks to you, and then think about how you might translate that in your own backyard. Just a section, maybe, just a footpath in this case. There are more and more nurseries that are providing native plants. To my knowledge, the only one at this point that is 100% native genotype is Earth Tones, which is in the northwestern part of the state. I highly recommend going there, but there are a number of other nurseries that are really serious about trying to provide more native plants. If you are a consumer, that is one of the best things that you can do, is go to your nursery and say, I'm looking for these particular plants, and here's why. The Connecticut NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farmers Association, is working on a project that's very exciting. They're hoping to be able to propagate Connecticut native plants and make them available to sell at scale at some point. So there are a lot of exciting things that are happening out there, and to the extent that we know that native plants are important and can be aesthetically very striking, a role that you can play is not only to bring them into your yard and talk to your neighbors about them, but also to be sure to talk to your local nursery person to say, I would be interested if you could bring in more native plants, because that's what I'm looking for. Next slide. So sort of in conclusion, and bringing it back to the environment, I mean, there's so many reasons why bringing a more ecological perspective to your garden is such a great thing to do and can be so meaningful in your own backyard. And boy, now that we're so many of us are at home 24/7, it's my garden has been a huge refuge for me. But it's also a part of a much larger system. And to the extent that all of our backyards are connected in some capacity, and all of our backyards really have, I like to say that we all have an estuary in our backyard, because no matter where our lawn is or our backyard landscape is relative to Long Island Sound, it is in the watershed, which means it's connected. And there's so many ways that a healthy watershed provides support for not just the pollinators that we're interested in, but the fish that migrate in, bringing resources from the ocean into the inland, and then taking the inland resources after they spawn and taking it back to the ocean. Those fish become food for the ospreys. And then we've got migratory birds, they're coming and going. There's just so many wonderful ways that the plants put together. And we have a real substantive opportunity to enhance that and be a part of that in our backyards. So I think last slide. Oh, No, this is my favorite quote, and I do want to read this to you because I think sometimes it's so easy to feel like I can't do this. I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't have the time, or I just don't know enough. And here's a great quote from Margaret Rankel it was an opinion piece, it was last year, and she said, I can remind myself all day long, every day, that there's a difference between doing something and doing nothing. That something, small as it might seem, is not nothing. The space between them is far apart, limitless stretching distances apart. It's the difference between a heartbeat and silence.
Hmm.
I love the quote.
Hmm.
Now I think we might be at the end of that.
All right. Well, I know there are some questions in the chat and the Q&A, and we've got 15 minutes. Judy, that was great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I will just jump right in. So Mindy has a couple questions. She said, I have a small yard with about 4 pollinator gardens. We have a lot of leaves. I want to put some of them in my gardens, but I don't know how much is too much. Is there an inch recommendation for putting leaves into garden beds?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there absolutely is too much. In fact, the piles that my neighbors brought and I helped them bring over, we just put them in one place because it was easier for them. And it's like, 3 feet deep. That's not good. I'm going to have to move some of that. Generally speaking, it should be light. It should be, like if it's light and fluffed up, it could be up to 4 inches. But generally speaking, you don't want it to be a big mat. So, 2 to 4 inches of fluffy leaves is perfect.
All right, so she actually so I think you answered this question. I've been leaving my flowers so the birds can eat the seeds, but I was wondering if I should cut the stalks at some point so the insects can overwinter in them. So in your presentation, you said cutting them in the spring back to 12 to 18 inches so the native bees could nest, but do we need to cut the stalks before so insects can overwinter?
No, you don't need to, because the insects will drill a hole into the stalk, and stay there.
Gotcha.
So the fear is if you cut it, to at the wrong place, you might actually be cutting out the plant that has gone. I mean, the insect that's gone in there to hibernate or to pupate over the winter. But again, it's an aesthetic, and I think people should feel really comfortable that the whole idea of messy gardens is there's a whole dialogue that's going on. In fact, there's a great blog if people are interested. It's called Monarch Gardens. Benjamin Voigt, who's written a very good book on the ethics of gardening, and he makes some very good recommendations about how to plant your garden and how to make it something that's comfortable for you and also good for the environment. I would recommend his blog.
Awesome. Karen asks, so leaving some soil bare for the insects is the exception to the suggestion to encourage more coverage to prevent carbon loss and encourage that web of root and plant variety.
Yep.
So is there a general rule of how much soil you should leave bare?
I don't have a great answer for that. The places where I get those ground nesting bees happen to be in the same places out at the edge of my lawn that are closer to the road, where I have very sandy soil. So grass, doesn't do really well there, and I just mow it. That's all I do. And there are areas that are open, but I also try to make a point, particularly in south-facing slopes, to leave an area open. And I have even brought in sand with the idea that on a southwest corner in my house, I put sand down with the idea that maybe that would be sufficient for some of the insects that really just need a soft sand. I experiment. And
that's interesting. So Mindy actually has sort of a follow-up question again about that. She's leaving the leaves. She said, should I leave all of them or rake my front lawn, which is south facing and well drained, so that some ground in my yard is exposed? We have several large oaks and our yard could be completely covered.
Yeah, and I think that if you've got lawn, always the idea of leaves on the lawn is not so much, a thick carpet of leaves is going to be a problem for your lawn. But the other thing you can do is mow over your leaves. And I've done that before too. And people say, oh, you're still going to kill your lawn, but it doesn't. It breaks down, and it's a way of contributing nutrients to your lawn.
Mhm.
If there's a way that you can accommodate some bare soil, particularly if it's bare soil that doesn't have a lot of roots. Now, the places where the bees come up in my yard, I don't have trees there, so they're not competing with roots. But maybe you experiment by bringing in a mound of soil and leaving some portion of that with the right exposure open. The other thing that's neat about providing open soil is that you'll get some interesting plants. Yes, sometimes that means weeds. Weed is just a plant that you don't want. So to me, all plants are kind of interesting. Some of them are more problematic than others. And of course, there are invasive species that we have to always be vigilant about. But the plants are pretty interesting.
So Alice has a question saying, if it's destructive to turn soil over, what should one do with heavy clay soil?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. And I think there's probably some really good advice, more specific on the internet, but clay soils, if you've got clay, you're going to add a very specific ingredients to that to try to lighten it up. And whether that's, you really have to read up on that because I don't have clay soil, so I don't deal with it, but it's, organic material always helps. And maybe there is a way of doing that where you're doing what the farmers do, which is basically a slit. You do slits and you put in the ingredients and turn it back over. I mean, if the objective is to get your clay soil to be more manageable, then yeah, you are going to have to break it up.
So do you use treated town water as opposed to rainwater in your water features?
Yeah, someone else just asked me that not too long ago, and I have never really thought about that. I have a rain barrel, but the rain barrel is taking water off my roof. And so I thought, geez, that's probably not so good either, really. I mean, I've got asphalt shingles, so I have not really considered that. I do tend to, when I clean out my water features, I use the jet feature on my my hose, and that is like a power washer. So I am actually using water to, run through the hose, and that hopefully means that it's getting a little bit cleaner water. But it's a good point.
So Alice also had another question. She said, I'm interested in the idea that you attract and value yellow jackets. However, do you believe the same encouragement should be extended to ticks?
Yes, invariably we get to the ticks. I have to say that I feel very fortunate, and I'm knocking on wood here because I have not had a lot of ticks. And I should say the caveat to that was this spring I had a lot of ticks, which was a surprise to me because I've had my house for over 25 years and I've never had a lot of ticks. But this year seemed to be more than usual. Having said that, I tend not to be, I think there's some people who ticks are more attracted to them than others. I don't know what that is, but it's like flies. My dad had a terrible problem with black flies in his head. But yeah, ticks, that is no question that's a tough issue, but Kirby Stafford at the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station in New Haven has written a whole book on ticks. It's a booklet, it's a pamphlet. I think you could probably get it online, and it's all about measures that you can take in your yard that will discourage ticks.
I have to say, I had my husband build me a possum box for our fourth wedding anniversary, because that is traditionally what the fourth wedding anniversary is all about, is the possum box.
I love it.
So he built it for me and we put it up. And so we have, possums that sort of come into our yard, and it's amazing. Obviously, sometimes they get picked off by coyotes and whatnot, but when we see possums regularly, our dogs do not have ticks. And obviously our dogs have tick medicine and whatnot, but so yeah, encouraging some animals to come in and do some pest control.
Yeah, I do think diversity on a large scale. I think that because I rarely am plagued by pest bugs. And I think that's because I've got a lot. I also had chickens for a number of years. Chickens were fantastic at I'm assuming ticks as well as.
Oh yeah, they love that. So let me go back to the Q&A. A few more questions over here. Lynn has some questions saying, any thoughts about milky spore disease to control grubs? Does it affect other life in the soil, or is it specific to grubs?
That's a great question, and I actually do not have trouble with. I have grubs. I'm not worried about the grubs because I also note that I have underground life as well as above ground life that love the grubs. In fact, I have a long-standing catbird family that for years we forged a relationship many years ago when I was turning sod to create new gardens, and I had grubs, and I eventually had the catbird right on my hand, eating the grubs out of my hand. So it was like, okay, that's great. The grubs work for me, but I think milky spore is recommended, but it's not a fast solution, just like the corn gluten. If it were a fantastic treatment, then everyone would be doing it. That's kind of the way I think.
And does milky spore disease, does it affect other things, or does it just impact the grubs?
I believe it's specific to the grubs, but I am not an expert on that at all.
Okay. Lynn also wanted to know, I understand it is important to cover the soil. In a vegetable garden, do you recommend mulch or cover crop for overwintering?
I think if you can swing a cover crop, that's the best way to do it, because you're actually working with the plant. You're working above the soil and below the soil. So that's a great way to do it.
Can you define a cover crop for someone who might not know what that is?
It's any plant, any like rye or anything that you can plant that will grow for as long as possible into the winter months, and can be then turned or just pulled up and made into organic material in the spring. The other thing is to look at, which is fascinating, and I'm going to try this, is it's called Hugelkultur, which is German, and it's a culture of using logs and wood as the core for your raised beds or for your garden.
Mm-hmm.
You're putting the logs down initially, and then you're covering that with organic material and then soil.
Oh.
And it's a way that it breaks down gradually and apparently makes the soil extremely rich.
Ooh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I thought it sounded good.
Oh, Lynn just said buckwheat is a great cover crop. It fixes nitrogen.
Yep, that's right. And there's, legumes, all of those are super.
That's great.
Yeah.
You had mentioned people getting soil tests now. Where can folks, because we have people from all over the state on this webinar. So
yes.
Where could people send in samples for, and how many samples would you need for your whole yard? And yeah, so where could people do a soil test?
I'm just pulling this up right now because you can go to Yukon Soil Nutrient Analysis Laboratory. You can just go www.soiltest, one word, so soiltest.yukon.edu.
I'm putting it in the chat, everybody.
There you go.
soiltest.yukon.edu. I'm going to write that down.
There's also a test that you can have done at the Ag Experiment Station in New Haven.
And so for a 1 acre, lot, how many samples would they need to send in? Would it just be?
They'll provide that recommendation. You'll get some information when you, they'll tell you how to take the test. Dawn Pettinelli is the manager there. She's terrific. She's been there for years, and she's very approachable. Good. In fact, she teaches a master composting class, which I'm going to be talking at this fall. I highly recommend it if you're really interested in soil and composting and knowing more about that relationship. But yeah, generally speaking, they'll tell you to take a scoop full, like a small scoop full of soil from 4 or 5 different areas, and pull it all together, mix it all together, and then they give you the bag, and you put it in the bag and mail it in.
Mm-hmm. And Alice actually wanted to know, is the soil analysis available if there's concern about contamination?
I mean, is there a soil analysis that you can do? No, the Yukon will not analyze it for contamination.
Okay.
Yeah, that could actually be really tricky depending on what you're thinking might be.
Okay. So, Karen actually just said to everybody, if you go to the soil test site, go to the fact sheets section, and there are a lot of great resources with soil and composting and gardening info too.
Yeah, in fact, the Yukon, the Master Gardening Program, if you love to garden and you've always wanted to know more, I highly recommend the Master Gardening Program. Lots of great resources.
I realized I put it in, I sent it just soil test. Can everyone see that? Hopefully soiltest.yukon.edu. When I sent it out earlier, I just sent it to the panelists. That's not helpful. All right, well, we are at 8:31. So I think I just want to say thank you so much, Judy, for being with us.
Great fun.
That was really great presentation. Everyone who joined us from home, thank you for being with us. I'm really glad that you were able to come. I will send out, this will be online in case there's anything you want to review or send to friends. And I'll also send out this link that's in the chat with the resources as well. And yeah, and I'll send Judy. Hopefully, if someone has questions to follow up, I can maybe send your email out, and they can kind of reach out.
Yes, and I should mention also that in the spring, we're looking at. I teach a class through the Master Gardening Program on. It's called the Coastal Certificate, and it does a lot of what I talked about this evening, which is making the link between Long Island Sound and gardening practices and landscaping. And I'm looking at doing sort of a hybrid out in the field and workshop in collaboration with Connecticut College and the Wild Ones chapter here.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds great. That's a great group too. So, all right, folks, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great fun.
Yeah, Judy, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. And everyone else, if you want to check out the website, irejn.org, we'll have other webinars coming up. And hopefully we'll be able to organize some COVID-safe, socially distant small hikes and walks in the woods so people can kind of get together in a safe manner.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I know. It'll be fun. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.